So in the past year, I've decided to add more pocket knives to my collection. I don't know why, I must be really bored. But pocket knives are pretty cool, and if you get into collecting them, there could be quite a few varieties out there, and you might someday want some way to store them or display them. Now, I don't really care about displaying them so much, but I didn't want them all in my nightstand drawer, so I designed a box that would hold them, but also work great for display purposes. And it features a lock to keep the kids out. Not exactly a theft deterrent, because I could just walk away with it or break the glass, but it will keep kids from getting in there. So let me show you the details. So the top is just the basic mitered frame. We've got some keys holding everything together, a little McAsser ebony strip there for decoration, and a retainer clip holding the glass in place. Beautiful Brusso hinges. I've got a locking mechanism here at the front. And there's storage, I would say, for anywhere from 14 to 20 knives, depending on the size. The box itself is held together with box joints, or finger joints, whatever you want to call them. The main box material is Bubinga, walnut panel on the bottom, and of course that ebony decorative strip. Let me show you how I made it. Before making any cuts, I used some scrap to determine the overall size of the box, as well as the shape of the inserts that will hold the knives in place. This will give me enough information to start cutting my good stock. I have a real nice piece of Bubinga that I think will look great. The parts are cut to rough size at the bandsaw. That includes the box sides and the box top frame. Because we'll be doing some box joints later, it's a real good idea to cut a couple of pieces of scrap to the same width as the box sides. The side stock is milled flat and square at the jointer, then plane to final thickness at the planer. At the table saw, I'll cut to final width and length. Now let's make a box joint jig. The method I use here is 100% copied from William Ing. I want my box joints to be about 1/4 inch wide, so I switched to my dado stack with the 2 outside cutters and a shim installed. I raised the blade height so it's just about a 32nd of an inch higher than the thickness of my box material. A test cut into my backer board will allow me to determine the actual width. With my calipers, I'm getting about 0.255. Now for some math. We need to cut an index pin that fits into the notch that we just cut, and it's important that the pin is slightly undersized to allow our workpiece to easily drop into place. So we'll make it about 4 thousandths narrower, or as close as we can get. I cut a strip of material at the bandsaw, and then sneak up on the perfect size with a hand plane. The strip isn't going to be perfectly consistent, so I'll just test a bunch of different areas and find the one that hits the number I want, which is 0.251. That section should fit snug, but not too tight. You'll also want to ease the top edges so that the workpiece doesn't get hung up when we put it onto the pin. Now the pin can be glued into the notch. Just make sure the pin doesn't protrude out of the back or the bottom. It can actually be a little bit recessed and still work perfectly. With the backer installed on the miter sled, we can now determine the position of the pin relative to the blade. This distance will determine the thickness of our pins. Yay, more math! We want our pins to be about 6 thousandths less than the openings. Any tighter, and they won't go together easily. Any looser, and the fit will be sloppy. To get close, I use some of the leftover pin stock to set the distance between the blade and the pin. Remember, that pin is approximately 4 thousandths less, so this should get us close to 6. On a piece of scrap, I do a test to see what the actual pin size will be. And it looks like we got lucky and nailed it at 0.249. If you don't nail it on the first shot, you can use feeler gauges and stop blocks to carefully adjust the fence left or right to make the fingers smaller or larger as needed. Now we'll use the test pieces that we cut to make a test joint. The first cut is made right against the pin. From there, the cuts are made with the workpiece straddling the index pin. The adjoining piece is cut using the first piece as a spacer, and from there, the cuts are made in the same fashion. Because our pieces are 2 inches wide and our box joints are pretty darn close to 1/4 inch, we'll get a nice even distribution. So now for the real deal. Lay the box parts out in the desired orientation and put a reference mark of some kind on the common edge. The opposing sides will be cut the same way, so I grab 2 and get ready to cut. The rule of thumb is that we always put the reference mark toward the pin. Once one end is done, flip the piece, place the reference mark toward the pin, and cut. This process gets repeated for the opposing box side. For the remaining two pieces, the cut starts with one of the already cut pieces being used as a spacer. Even the spacer piece follows that rule of putting the reference mark toward the pin. The remaining cuts will utilize the index pin for spacing. This process is repeated for the other end of the side piece, as well as both ends of the last side piece. Let's do a quick dry assembly. Looking tight? Now we can cut the bottom panel groove. One side gets stopped grooves since we don't want to see the hole on the outside of the box. I'll place marks that let me know where to stop, just a little bit over 1/4 inch from the shoulder. The other two pieces receive through grooves, because the groove falls in the gap between the fingers. At the router table, I'll use the marks that I made and do a drop cut onto the bit. It's always a good idea to use a stop at the beginning of the cut for additional security. The bit itself is actually a slightly undersized plywood bit. You can just lift the workpiece off, but I'm always more comfortable holding it in place until the router spins down. The through cuts are of course much easier. I'll use some 1/4 inch ply for the box bottom. Let's see how that bottom panel fits. Alright, that looks pretty good. We're not ready to glue up just yet though. Next, we have to install the lock mechanism. It's a simple half mortise lock that will mortise in 3 parts. First is the shallow mortise for the top flange. With the lock upside down, I can scribe around it to get the exact shape. I like to use a thin pencil to help darken the lines. To prepare for routing, I make a scrap piece flush with the top of the front piece and throw the assembly in the vise. The scrap will add much needed support for the router. The bit depth is set to the thickness of the flange, which really isn't much at all. The bulk of the material is routed away, getting as close to the line as possible. Using chisels, we can clean up the mortise, going back to the cut lines. The corners of the lock are rounded, so I carefully remove the stock to try to match the shape. The next part of the mortise is done with the workpiece flat. I'll set a cutting gauge to the vertical dimension of the lock and scribe the inside of the front. I can then extend the side lines from the flange mortise that we already cut down to the scribe line. This mortise is again for the flange of the lock, so it's really shallow. The final part of the mortise is the deepest. I mark it out and begin routing. This one is pretty much just a clearance mortise, so it doesn't need to be absolutely perfect. To make room for the key, I use a drill bit to hog out that area. This doesn't need to be pretty since it's going to be covered up later. Now I'll pop the key in just to make sure that the mechanism is working correctly. And now for the glue up. Whenever possible, it's a good idea to tape off your joints to protect that area from glue, especially when we're talking about an inside corner. The glue I'm using is Titebond's polyurethane glue. Poly glue gets a bad rap amongst woodworkers because it's really sticky and it tends to foam up as it cures, but I've been using it at times when I might normally use epoxy, such as when I need more working time, or in this case, when a water-based glue might swell the joints so much that it's impossible to get them together. This polyurethane glue actually kind of acts like a lubricant, making it easier to push the joints together. The tape will protect the insides from squeeze out, and the outside still needs to be worked, so that squeeze out really doesn't matter. Now, it's not going to replace my trusty water-based glue for most things, but I do find myself reaching for the poly glue lately instead of a 2-part epoxy. It's a good idea to wipe away the excess glue. If you really want to clean it up well, you probably want to use something like mineral spirits. Once the glue is dry, I peel off the tape and clean up as needed. After a little chisel and scraper action, the area is sanded lightly and the corner's ready to go. Hairy hands. To clean up the outside faces, I'll start with a block plane. Remember how we set the dado blade about a 32nd of an inch higher than the thickness of our workpieces? That's where this 32nd shows itself. It results in box joints that sit proud of one another. This makes it easy to flush them up without having to remove stock from the entire side of the box. Now, I don't want to gouge the surface at all, so I eventually switch to a sanding block. Only 2 adjacent sides need to be cleaned up because we can cut the other sides when making the bevel cut at the table saw. Each cut removes about a 1/4 inch from the top of the box with the blade at about 7 degrees. I'll tell you, few things make your butt pucker up quite as much as running a nearly finished piece through a table saw. But that's life on the edge as a dust-slinging badass. Bubinga. You can see now why we only needed 2 clean faces. We make the first 2 cuts with the clean faces against the fence. For the last 2 cuts, the newly beveled faces can go against the fence. Back at the workbench, I'll clean up the beveled faces with a card scraper and some sanding. That's as far as we'll take the base for now. Let's make the frame for the top. The frame parts are made from a glue-up of Bubinga with an 1/8 inch thick strip of Macassar ebony. This is a piece of ebony that my buddy Vic gifted to me when I was in Seattle last year, and it's the first time I've got the guts to cut into it. Those strips are then glued to the Bubinga pieces and clamped in one big sandwich. Once the glue dries, the pieces are milled square on one edge, and then cut to final width at the table saw. The top is a mitered frame, so I'll make some quick 45-degree cuts using a stop block for consistency. With 2 passes at the table saw, we can make a double rabbet that captures the glass and allows us to use some shop-made strips as retainers. Now the frame can be glued together. I get a lot of questions about this strap clamp. It's called the Merrill clamp, and it's available from MLCS. Because miter joints on their own aren't very strong, I'm adding a key to each corner. The cut is made using a key cutting jig at the table saw. If you have a square tooth blade, now's the time to use it. By the way, did you know I have a book about joinery? It's called Essential Joinery, and it covers all the basics including how to make keyed miters using this jig. Check it out on Amazon, or you could buy it directly from us at essentialjoinery.com. The keys themselves will be made from small strips of Bubinga. You could use a hand plane, a sanding block, or something like a drum sander to size the strip to the slot. Even with the drum sander, I'll take a few passes with a sanding block to get the fit just perfect. Back at the bandsaw, I'll cut the strip into small triangles. Now we can glue the keys into the frame. You could use any glue that you want for this, but if the fit is right, a water-based glue can swell the key and make it really difficult to seat, so I'll be using poly glue again. To make sure there are no gaps at the back of the keys, I'll use the same clamp to secure all 4 in place. Now, it's not always necessary, but you might consider adding some supplemental clamping pressure toward the corners, and that'll help sandwich the pieces together and prevent any gaps. Once the glue is dry, the excess can be trimmed at the bandsaw. To flush everything up, I'll use a sanding block. To find out how much we'll need to cut off, I'll center the lid on the box and mark the overhang at the ends. At the table saw, I'll tilt the blade so that it matches up with the line from our mark going to the top outside corner, which should be about 15 degrees. I found the easiest way to make this cut is to put pressure down near the blade, where the frame is more likely to chatter. Then I use my right hand to hold the frame against the fence and push forward. Now we can finally add those hinges. I'm using JB102 stop hinges from Brusso. The great thing about these is that they hold the lid open at 95 degrees without using additional hardware. Once I have the location set, I scribe one side of the hinge. With the knife in the scribe line, I'll butt up the hinge itself to the knife to locate it perfectly and then scribe the other side. To help support my router, I'll attach a piece of 3/4 inch ply. With the bit set to the hinge leaf thickness, I'll remove the bulk of the material. And now I can use a chisel right in my scribe line to finish up the mortise. A thing to keep in mind here, the hinge knuckle needs full clearance in order for this to work properly. This is because the knuckle on this model is square, so if any part of that square is sitting on top of wood, it will not rotate. But for now, I'll use a piece of scrap as a stop and drill the holes for the screws. You'll see later that I need to make a slight adjustment to allow for that rotation. Now, a good hardware company will not only send you the brass screws for the hinge, but they'll also send you at least one steel screw of the exact same size. This way we can cut the threads with steel and prevent stripping our brass screws. Once both mortises are done on the base, we can mortise the lid. I'll clamp the lid in place, and using the marking knife, I'll transfer the location of the hinge directly to the lid. From there, I could use the little notches to extend the lines on the lid itself. Because the lid is wider than the base, we'll also need a line for the long edge of the hinge leaf. The lines are pretty tricky to see on this ebony, so I'll use a white charcoal pencil to fill them in. Once again, we'll route the excess. Because the screws are a little long for this lid, I'll cut the threads, but I won't go to full depth. The brass screws will be cut by about 1/8 of an inch. To accommodate the rotation of the hinge, I'm going to relieve a little bit of material by making a small chamfer, and that should allow it to rotate fully. Now that the hinges are installed, we can add that last bit of hardware, the catch piece. It's the same length as the lock, so I could just transfer those lines to the front of the box, and then transfer those to the lid. From there, it's a pretty simple mortising operation, though I do need to use a smaller bit to get this job done. A little cleanup, and the catch drops right in. Now we can drill for the screws that hold the lock in place. I sometimes get questions about why I wear my respirator when I'm not really making dust. The answer is actually pretty simple. I was likely making dust just before this scene, and it's still in the air, so the mask stays on until the air is clear. Next up, I'll cut some 1/8" strips for glass retainers. The pieces should fit nicely on the top rabbet. The retainers will essentially be a small mitered frame, so we'll cut the 45s at the table saw. And now for the glass. I'll use a standard glass cutter to score right on the line, and then I can easily snap off the offcut. Now I can locate my retainer strips and drill for screws. The holes in the strips are widened a bit so that the screw only bites into the frame. We'll do the final installation after finishing. The last bit of woodworking is making the racks for the knives. With a board cut to the right length, we'll rip it into 7 strips. Each strip gets a nice 40-degree bevel cut into one face. I'll also cut some plywood into 1/2" strips that we'll be able to use as spacers. The strips are all sanded clean, and the edges are given a slight round over before installing. Because this is going to be awkward to clamp, and these racks really won't have to hold a lot of weight, I'm going to use both regular wood glue and CA glue at the same time. The CA glue will immobilize the piece after about a minute, at which point the regular wood glue can begin to cure. It's kind of the best of both worlds in a situation where you don't want to use clamps. I originally planned to flock the interior of the box, so the grain direction of the bottom panel really didn't matter. Later I decided not to do the flocking, and unfortunately the bottom panel grain doesn't sync up with the grain direction of the inserts. Oh well, you can't win them all. Now we can apply some finish. I'm using Osmo Pollux oil. I use a white Scotch-Brite pad to apply it sparingly to the surface and buff it in, and a small acid brush helps to get it into the corners. Once fully coated, I'll buff the surface with a shop rag. Once the finish dries, I can do the final installation of the hardware. And don't forget to clock your screws. The escutcheon has tiny nails that are likely to break or bend if I pound them into this Bubinga, so I'm using a pin vise to pre-drill a small hole that should make the job a little bit easier. Now we can finally load it up with the knives. I'm wearing my DuluthFlex Firehose pants, which are really helpful when I can't decide what knife I want to carry that day. Oops, almost forgot one. These pants are actually really durable and incredibly comfortable, and they don't restrict movement when doing my morning pre-work stretches, or when I'm making my coworker uncomfortable by resting my leg in an awkward position while explaining something. More importantly, they make my butt look good. Eyes up here, boys. I've been wearing Duluth for years now, and I can't say enough good things about their clothes. They're durable, comfortable, and the company has a great sense of humor. Check them out at your local store or use our special link to visit them online. So there it is, an elegant way to store your pocket knife collection, or even watches. If you watched this entire video and wondered why someone would spend this much time and effort on something like a knife case, shut up. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.